Hello, America. Welcome to the Entrepreneurs Network Radio, the nation's crossroads for serial and aspiring entrepreneurs, angel investors, and helpful service providers. I'm Rick Anthony, entrepreneur, angel investor, consultant, author, and teacher. Each week, we bring you big ideas, fascinating guests, fabulous listening, and valuable lessons learned from entrepreneurs and business experts from markets coast to coast and border to border. My friend Ira Wolfe, founder and CEO of Success Performance Solutions and author of the upcoming book, When the Shift Hits Your Plan, has been studying trends in the U.S. labor force and the lifestyles of generational cohorts for the past 20 years. One of his early books, The Perfect Labor Storm, sounded the alarm about shortages of a qualified workforce in the U.S., even in the depths of the Great Recession. He's doing it again in When the Shift Hits Your Plan, this time asserting that demographers and marketers need to see generational cohorts like Millennials and Baby Boomers differently. Welcome, Ira, to the Entrepreneurs Network Radio.
Good afternoon, Rick. It's a pleasure to be with you again. Thanks.
I always enjoy our conversations because you're always just a step ahead of everybody else. But I'm intrigued by your latest thesis that the shifts occurring among all generations, but especially millennials and baby boomers, are going virtually unnoticed by demographers and market research experts. What is the major shift you see occurring right now, and where is it headed?
It's a good question. It's a complicated question, too. I'll try to take it down to 2 points that I see, at least on the surface. One is we've classified the generations. I wrote a book about it. We've talked about it, and so have a lot of other people. And, typically, whether it's a baby boomer or Generation X or millennials, they've spanned the 15 or 20 years, and then trends tended to change. Within each of those groups, we've had people that have been enormously successful and talented, and other people just seem to, ride the curve. Everybody raised the level of the water so their boats floated. Certainly in the last 10 to 15 years, that's changed. And, when I wrote the Geek Skeezers and Googlization, I started to see a shift, and it wasn't as much of the age-dependent demographic as much as it was maybe technology-dependent demographic. Mm-hmm. So I started to look across those and talk about more of the wired and the tired. That there were, you and I, and probably me more than you, but, here I am, an older baby boomer, and I'm doing my best to keep up with technology. I've been accused of being that millennial trapped in the baby boomer body, but I'm, I live and die and breathe, and my business runs on technology. Mm-hmm. And, I'm always looking for something better, and yet I have lots of peers that some of them are 10, 15 years younger that are really struggling. I mean, they just are. They were happy with the way things were. Yes. Got a little complacent, and their flip phones still okay. Mm-hmm. It's just not complicated. So I think one of the big trends that people are missing is that across generations, we're seeing this wired and tired versions of the generations. The other part is that what's really changed over the last 10 or 15 years, and it just accelerates, is just change. Each of the generations in the past was almost affected by or impacted and influenced by a particular trend or innovation. And the life cycle of the innovation lasted 10, 20, 30, 40 years. It even crossed generations. Mm-hmm. Because although we went from, let's say, the telephone, I remember having to call the operator when I was young. I lived in a small town in Pennsylvania, and we still had operators. But shortly thereafter, we had the dial. And then it went to the push button, and then you didn't have to have a black phone with the push button. You could have colors, and then you had the Princess phone, and then we had the first mobile phones, and so we've had all that, but we still had a phone. I mean, that was still the primary mode of communication, and regardless of, you picked up the handle or the receiver, and it worked. And all of a sudden, now we're sitting with smartphones, and it's really not a smartphone at all. It's a computer that happens to just be able to communicate with other people through a phone call, but most people don't use it that way, and that's the primary sense of a phone. So the one thing we've seen in the last 20 years in addition to the wired and the tired, and maybe that's influenced that, is that that technology is just exponentially changing and accelerating. And it's tough for every generation to deal with it. But what we lose perspective of is that, like Generation Z, which, let's say those are born from 1996 on, so the oldest ones are now 20, they've only known this world. Mm-hmm. They've only known a world that all this stuff is changing fast. And you and I have a perspective that, hey, things could last 20 or 30 years. And that's, now if we have 20 or 30 days, it's almost a lifetime for some entrepreneurial companies.
Mm-hmm. I'm a little confused then, because if the millennials are comfortable with technology, rapidly changing technology, and Generation Z is born with it, to some extent like the predecessors, they were born with a chip in their head, why will we have difficulty filling the estimated 10 million jobs in the U.S. for which some claim we don't have enough qualified candidates? Even you, in your book a few years back, The Perfect Labor Storm, were predicting that there would be 10 million jobs that we could not find people for. Is there a dichotomy there?
Well, I think the one thing that's changed is we may not have those jobs because they're going to be automated. So some of that perspective may change. But yeah, I'm not sure it's a dichotomy. I think we have to be very careful with the wording and the semantics that we use. Just because you were born in that age where the expectation is that technology is with us, we're going to use technology every day. You're not going to go to the library. You're not going to buy a World Book or Encyclopedia Britannicas to get reference books once a year. You can get that anytime that you want in a click of a button, and it's been updated minutes ago. Right. So part of it is that's the context in which they live. It doesn't necessarily mean that they know that all millennials and Generation Z know how to use it. Mm-hmm. And that's another divide, and maybe that's where the part of the wired and the tired is. It's well documented that we've got that the middle class is going away, and we have, a rising upper class, and we have a growing lower class of citizens, and yes, most of that socioeconomic. But because of that, there's a huge divide in the availability of not only the technology that's available to them, but the access, but the ability to learn how to use that. Mm-hmm. So the lower income populations, and especially the minorities, they have an incredibly high saturation that uses smartphones. Now, that doesn't mean they're savvy with technology. They may have to download an app and use all those applications. But in real life application, real life, how do they monetize that skill? And mm-hmm, that's the challenge. And it's confusing because people say, oh, okay, so they're naturally gifted. No, mm-hmm, they should be, because they've only grown up with that, but nobody's really teaching them how to use it. Yes. On the other respect is things change so fast, I'm not sure anybody knows how to use it all. It's really getting subspecialized.
At a recent presentation I heard you give downtown, you said you predicted that my grandkids graduating high school or college would be competing with robots for jobs. And you weren't pushing out to the year 2050, 2060. As I recall, you were talking about something that is comparatively near term. To the extent that actually happens, that is humans competing with robots, if it isn't already happening, for jobs, what are the policy implications of that? That is, how will the government and employers deal with millions more displaced workers, displaced by technology?
Well, I appreciate that. That was certainly one of my points that yes, they hope got across, or the whole purpose of the summit, how change is happening so fast, and our policies and procedures, both governmental and academic and just society norms, are being not necessarily just disrupted. Yes. But one of the things that I read recently in Thomas Friedman's new book, he talks about a differentiation between disruption, which is merely an inconvenience, and a dislocation. And we're having industries and people and jobs and actually just societal norms that are being dislocated. Mm-hmm. They just don't work anymore in today. So it has enormous implications. From obviously, we can get down to education of what are the skills that we need to have, but preparing people for a career, which means that in 10 to 15 years they'll be able to still continue to apply the skills and the knowledge that they learned 15 years prior, is just absurd. Mm-hmm. The speed of change, they've already recognized that what somebody learns as a freshman in college, by the time they graduate, that knowledge is out of date, and that job may be out of date.
Yes.
Right. So how do you educate people for jobs that don't exist yet? Where should government be putting the money? How is that going to affect incomes and schools, and who's going to pay taxes, and where the revenue is going to come from? And so the implications are enormous and way beyond trying to solve this in a 15-minute conversation. But they're there, and that's what my book, one of the sub points of my book is. I don't have all the answers. I'd be foolish to think that, and basically a narcissist or an egomaniac to think that I do. But the reality is part of, I say, it's the spark pivotal conversations. But and that's what we need.
Yeah, then you do raise perplexing questions for which you do not provide answers. But that's part of the intrigue of it all, I guess. You just mentioned a phrase, though, that got me to think. I hadn't thought about this. Career planning. I guess it is folly for career counselors, for academics, for teachers to continue to talk in terms of career planning. They should be substituting it with life planning. That is, to develop the skills you're going to need to be able to adapt, adjust, and exploit. And I don't mean that in the negative way. Exploit opportunities as they are presented to you.
You're absolutely correct. Yeah, and maybe it's, again, going back to semantics. When people equate a career to a job, what's my career? Oh, I'm going to be a doctor. I'm going to be an attorney. I'm going to be a lawyer. I'm going to be a welder, a tradesman, whatever it is that we basically equated career with job title. Mm-hmm. And that's just bad advice. If we're looking at it going forward, if when somebody says, what are the skills that we're going to need 5 years from now? What should we be training people on? Well, one of them, however you want to define it, and I know this is a broad term, but it's critical thinking. So making good decisions, right. But it's also not necessarily go back to the kind of the root of that. My leadership in masters, I mean, we dissected how people make decisions, because it's now evaluating the information that's available. Some of the base decisions are made. The time we invested in doing the research is we don't need to do that. I mean, it's a click of the button and we can get that. Yeah. But how do we evaluate the quality of that research? And then more importantly, how do we correlate that with some other information that we saw? So I think two of the core skills are curiosity. I mean, there's a lot of people just don't have the curiosity to even ask. They just take things for granted. And then the question, the part beyond that is, how do we process so much information, dissect the myths from the truth and the facts, and then make sense of it? Yeah. A lot of that's going to be done by computers. So now you're already forcing people to even a higher level of that. But that's a basic skill. But the other part is, and you mentioned this just briefly before, about, hey, our grandkids may grow up in a world where you're going to be for some jobs are going to be replaced by robots. But the other is considering that a robot is not your tool, but your colleague. Yes. That there's going to be a relationship that up until now, technology has helped improve my value and your value and lots of people's value, because it's helped us it helped make us more productive. But what happens when it's a mutual relationship? What happens when that I will make that the robot will help, or the software, whatever, just a bot, will make me more valuable, but that I too will make it more valuable? And I've got to treat it as my colleague, right, not as my tool. And there's going to be a transition before that with machine learning, maybe they'll replace all the jobs. But, at least in the next 20 or 30 years, there's going to be a transition. And that's a major mindset change that people just don't get.
It sure is. What is Microsoft's Watson?
Yes.
Yeah. Where doctors huddle around the machine for briefings on the latest developments in their specialties because the machine
because their brain
can process faster.
Well, they bring, they can process. There's 8,000 research papers that are released every day in the country, peer-reviewed clinical research. Yeah. It's incomprehensible for a human being to digest all that.
It's amazing.
So to be able to do that. So what the doctors are able to do is come to the table and review that information rather than spend all the time in research.
Okay, Ira, bring all this home for me now. This is a program about and for entrepreneurs. So what does all of this mean for entrepreneurs in terms of the types of ventures that will succeed and the types of jobs successful ventures will create?
It's interesting. I write the weekly newsletter, and part of my newsletter this week was that every company, regardless if they're a brand new startup or an existing company, has to act like a startup. They basically have to say, we have a lot of legacy policies, procedures, programs, business models, product services that we deliver that are going to be changed or gone. So everybody's got to go in the startup mode. The other part of that is that with that, you recognize that a lot of the work, products, and services that were either made, delivered, or how they were done, that were humans involved, are now going to be handled by automation and robots. Okay. So what's left? The startups that are going to be successful are, one, removing the complexity from things that we do. Essentially is whether it was doing that research or whether it was making trying to connect a call or do a web meeting or whatever it is, is the technologies that are winning out are those that are reducing the complexity. But the other is really thinking out, and I mean out 5, 10, 15, 20 years, and that's probably as far as you can possibly go. Right. What are the things that robots and automation will replace humans? And what are the things that won't be done in that time span? And the startups, to be successful is really looking at what is the work that will still, for a job, what is the work that will still need to be done by a human being, or at least partially done, even in collaboration with the technology. Everything else that we know how to do, it's going to be a lot of people competing to do it.
Ira, but there's, for every trend, there's a counter trend. And so 10 or 15 years from now, the premium may be on those products that have a label made by a human being. It
could be if we're willing to pay for it. Yeah. I mean, I think there's going to be boutique opportunities. It's like classic cars.
Yeah, exactly.
That classic cars don't have computers as engines. They got good old motors. Yeah. And there are people that specialize in that, make a good living, and people are willing to pay a premium for it. Yeah. But it's not going to float everybody's boat. It's not going to raise the quality of living for everybody.
We've just scratched the surface of your thesis and your upcoming book, the title of which, again, is When the Shift Hits Your Plan. I can't wait to read it. Yeah. Thanks again very much, Ira, for spending time with us today.
My pleasure.
My guest today has been Ira Wolf, who is the founder and president of CEO of Success Performance Solutions, and the author of the upcoming book, When the Shift Hits Your Plan. Until next time, this is the Entrepreneurs Network Radio. I'm Rick Anthony.